This is quite a timely discussion given the new announcement today from BIS, update of rules. Certainly from China tech threats perspective, a lot of these things may sound great at the surface, but we want to dig in and say, well, what does this really mean? Are we really improving security, or is this just about protecting the revenue of sales to China? So we have a great discussion today with a panel. My friend and colleague, Jeff Ferry, Chief Economist from the Coalition for a Prosperous America. We have Steve Koonin, who was the former Senior Foreign Affairs Advisor of Defense Technology Security. He has an excellent paper, A China Tech Threat, called Willful Blindness, just talking about his career and his efforts to try to bring transparency about the supply chain challenges in the U.S. military. You can learn about that. And also, so pleased to have Nazak Nakakhtar. She's with Wiley Rein, but former Assistant Secretary for Industry and Analysis at Department of Commerce. So our session today, we're going to have a short presentation on the China Tech Threats paper called Cash Over Country. Jeff will do that for 5 minutes, and then we're going to go into our panel discussion where we'll respond to that presentation. We'll also talk about the news today. We have time for questions and engagement with the audience, and we want to wrap up by the top of the hour. So thank you all for joining us, and Jeff, please give us your presentation.
Thank you, Rosalind. Good afternoon. I'm Jeff Ferry. As Rosalind said, I'm the Chief Economist for the Coalition for Prosperous America. I also want to mention that I was an economist at the beginning of my career, and now at the latter part of my career, I'm an economist again. In between, I was a marketing executive at a number of technology companies, including Infinera, which is a company in Sunnyvale, California, which makes chips today, and is the only company to have built a new greenfield fab in Silicon Valley in the last 20 years. So I've got pretty good familiarity with the industry. So let me take you through some of the high points of cash over country right now. So the background is, as many of you know, China had a plan, Made in China 2025, which targeted self-reliance in a number of industries they considered critical. They updated that plan in 2019 by raising the percentage of chips they consume that they targeted to be made within China. They raised it to 80% by 2030, and they're still striving to reach that goal. So China has no interest in free trade, no interest in globalization. They're interested in building up the Chinese economy, particularly in strategic sectors, and that means sectors that benefit from civil-military fusion. And nothing is more important today to civil-military fusion than the semiconductor. In October 2022, over here on our side, the Biden administration imposed export controls on equipment used to produce so-called advanced chips, which are defined as chips where the line width in the transistor is less than 28 nanometers. And we'll talk more about those export controls this afternoon. However, there are two things wrong with those export controls from my point of view. The first thing is that what the chip industry has begun calling legacy chips, and I call mainstream chips, account for 80% of the market. So if we allow China to dominate legacy chips, that means we will be dependent on China in 5 or 10 years, because their goal is to put Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan and Singapore out of that business and dominate that business. And to give you an example, the typical automobile contains, it is said, about 1,000 chips. 100% of those chips are legacy chips. You don't need any advanced chips to do an automobile. You don't need any advanced chips to fly a drone and blow up people in the Middle East. So that puts some context on what I call mainstream chips. The second point is that the export controls on advanced chip-making equipment are not working. They're not stopping China from developing and building and manufacturing advanced chips. And my colleagues and I will talk more about that in a moment. The evidence we put in our Cash Over Country report comes from the financial results, public reported results of the major semiconductor equipment makers, known as tool makers. There are four main ones: Applied Materials, ASML, ASM Lithography, KLA, and Lam Research. And what you can see in this table, it's a little hard for me to read everything, but basically revenue has skyrocketed. Sales to China were in last year up to $18 billion. Sales to America were $7 billion. So China it dominates the fab building business. Fabs are the factories where chips are made. It dominates that business. It's investing tens, if not $100 billion a year in building up that business. And US companies, one of those four companies, ASM, is Dutch, although ASM relies on a lot of technology it purchased in Silicon Valley to make its high resolution equipment. So US companies are continuing to enable China. You can see that even more clearly in this graph, where you can see that sales to China have risen over this period by 103%. Sales to the US are rising strongly because the CHIPS Act, even though it's only just taken effect, companies like Intel and Micron have got the memo and they're buying more equipment to use in the US. So US sales are up 82%, which is pretty good, but sales to China are up even more because the Chinese are more serious and more determined to be the world leader in both advanced and mainstream chips. And that's the challenge of the United States. So since we wrote that paper, I've got an update for you. On August 30th, many of you might know this, Huawei released a new smartphone called the Mate 60, which was based on a 7-nanometer chip made by HiSilicon, designed by HiSilicon, a subsidiary of Huawei, and manufactured by another Chinese company called SMIC. This chip is actually an amazing chip. They built a 7-nanometer chip even though we banned them from buying 7-nanometer equipment. And the way they did that is through using previous generation equipment, which if you fiddle with it, you can make it produce chip transistor semiconductors with a line width of 7 nanometers. And the best analyst in the semiconductor industry in Silicon Valley is a guy named Dylan Patel. Dylan said in a printed report, and he told me when I spoke to him, that this chip is only a couple of years behind what Qualcomm is producing today as the processors for the Apple iPhone. Actually, you might have noticed in today's news, Apple's sales in China are disappointing with the new iPhone 15. Doing very well in the US, but they're disappointing. Why? Because the Chinese would rather buy the Huawei Mate 60. Dylan described this new chip as technically incredible, and in his view, US sanctions have failed. So our conclusions are that Chinese domination of the mainstream chip-making market threatens US and global chip design industry, and it threatens US manufacturing industry. We could see again what we saw during COVID. The loss of chip making would make industries from defense equipment to autos to home appliances to computer gear even more dependent on China than they already are today. The Huawei and SMIC achievement shows China's ability to produce advanced chips is very strong. They are catching up rapidly. The BIS of the Department of Commerce has the capability to increase the effectiveness of US export controls, and we're going to talk more about that. And the US must protect and encourage both its mainstream and advanced chip business. Okay, thank you. With that, back to you, Brussels.
Great job, Jeff, and thanks for bringing us up to date. I'm going to turn to our panel. Steve, let me start with you. I'm sure that you have some reactions to this report, given your role, and maybe you'll talk a little bit about that, and then you've written quite extensively from your own perspective, so I'd just love to hear, how does it strike you, these findings?
Aside.
Just push the button. Should light up.
It's not lighting up, but I'll speak loud.
There it is.
First of all, thanks to the China Tech Threat folks and the Coalition for Prosperous America. Thank you for inviting me to this, and thank you all for coming. I think maybe the best way from an export control standpoint, again, I used to work export control issues specifically from China for the Department of Defense, would be just for those that aren't conversant on export controls, and I think there may be a handful, just to back up for a second, is just there's two key elements that any functioning export control regime requires. And one is to know how that technology is going to be used. And when a U.S. applicant wants to transfer something, let's say to China, they ask the ultimate end user, or the end user that's receiving that technology, to sign how they're going to get that. So for our friends in like France or Germany, any of our allies and partners, we are very comfortable with them using that technology and putting it into a military capability. Those are called dual-use technologies. And those are the concerns that we have, primarily, I had primarily with China, because the controls that we have for military unique items that are controlled on our ITAR, those are prohibited from going to China. So our main concerns are with dual-use technologies. So we operate under the presumption that the end user is actually giving us an accurate and honest end use. But we know, Jerry mentioned China's military civil fusion strategy, which has been publicly announced by the head of state nonetheless. So Chairman Xi has said, we will divert technology from from civilian end use to the military. I think, in fact, it may be the only country that's publicly has a policy like that. I mean, how bold is that? So that's, when they do that though, they turn the export controls on their head, because that's the basis under which we decide how we're going to, the US government decides how they're going to transfer exports. And yet it seems as though our colleagues within the export control arena at large, in particular in the Department of Commerce with the Bureau of Industry and Security, I think they understand that, but they have selected or elected not to be alarmed by that. So that in itself wouldn't be too alarming if the U.S. government had an effective verification mechanism. Now, with all of our other trading partners and allies, we have a mechanism where for 5 to 9 years, these are bilateral agreements that we have with our other trading partners. We have 5 to 9 years to do what we call post-shipment verification. So they said they were going to do this. It's like the Ronald Reagan trust but verify, or I guess it's actually a Russian proverb. But nonetheless, we need to verify. That verification mechanism acts as a tool to dissuade companies from diverting their technology from the stated civil end use or from its stated end use to where it may end up going for nefarious purposes. So with China, that arrangement is good for 6 months. And then it's only good for a portion of the exports that we send. Some of the exports, if they don't reach a certain dollar amount, they don't have an end-use statement that's signed off by China's Ministry of Commerce, and therefore there's no means for us to go verify, to do that post-shipment verification to see how China's actually. So we have 6 months with a handful, and there's only 2 export control officers assigned to China. And the Ministry of Commerce is very, and by the way, the U.S. sells more dual-use controlled, militarily useful technology to China than any other country in the world. And we approve over 91% of it. And so we only have 2 export control officers, the Ministry of Commerce, Chinese Ministry of Commerce, not too dissimilar from our own, is not very cooperative when it comes to arranging with visits to actually do those post-shipment verifications. But it almost doesn't matter, because after 6 months, China can do whatever they want then with that technology. So actually, the bilateral agreement that we have is more of an invitation to divert technology than it is a dissuasive tool, because after 6 months, they can do whatever they want. There's no mechanism in place for us to verify how U.S. technology is actually being used in China. So I think, Rosalind, that's in a nutshell, from a very high level, they have a policy to divert technology, and the U.S. government has no mechanism to see how it's actually being used. And I think that's a point that individuals in the export control arena understand and appreciate, but it's something that they must remain willfully blind to acknowledge. Simply, in my opinion, it's because the economic argument becomes more persuasive than the national security argument, and those that are responsible for the national security reviews, in my opinion, are not doing their job very effective. And I'll stop with.
Okay. Thank you for that. So, Nazak, let me turn to you. We have hit on this problem, but let's pivot to some solutions. BIS gets a lot of attention. You worked at Commerce. There's probably not a silver bullet solution. There might be more of an all-government approach, and I know that sounds a little trite, but maybe can you talk about this need to keep our defense supply chains free and clear of dangerous Chinese government technologies? And how do we ensure that our defense supply chain is has the integrity it needs?
Thank you, Rosalind, and just thanks for having me here, and I'm a fan of everyone here's work. I want to start, if I may, just kind of explaining how we got here, because it's worth everybody understanding what the government had done. So in 2001, China joins the WTO. As part of its accession agreement, it basically wants to reform to a market economy. And around 2002, 2005, China started telling the government, yes, we have these bubbles of capitalism, right? Like, we are growing, we're moving towards capitalism, we have these bubbles. Well, by 2006, I was in the government, and I was in the International Trade Administration. I was auditing Chinese companies for the US government. Those bubbles burst. Then the government kind of doesn't know what to do with respect to China policies. These bubbles burst, what do we do next? And then the economic recession happens. And then China's reaction is, oh my gosh, we had looked to the model, the US economy as a model, the gold standard, seems like it's not working so well, so let's really double down on our command style economy, non-market economy, where the central government dictates land, energy, raw material prices, et cetera, on labor, et cetera. And so we go into that, and at the same time we're in recession, we have this greater dependence on cheaper stuff from China, so that sort of continues. Then we start becoming desperate. China's completely doubled down on its non-market economy system, right? Because it's just lost the allure of the U.S. capitalist system. It's doubled down on its non-market economy system, but we, the government, we have sold everybody on this fiction that it's going to be really important to engage with China because China is going to transform. So let's double down on our engagement. Let's do export promotion strategies. Let's provide more critical technologies to China. Let's loosen the export control through the export control reform period to move things from the defense of the USML, that controls defense articles. Let's move them on the commerce control list, and then let's build in loopholes into those rules to get more exports to China. By 2015, the US government realizes, oh shoot, I made a huge mistake, and this is where we're at now. We didn't prevent the technology at the time we needed to, which would explain why China's raced ahead. And now going to the solutions, and I also want to underscore something really important that Jeff Ferry said, if you think about, and just again, having done this for many, many years, if you think about sort of innovation as a triangle, you have the commodity sectors, and the revenue from the commodity sectors funds R&D for next-gen technologies. China goes after the commodity sectors. China's been going after the commodity sectors for 20 years. That's why when it joined the WTO, we started seeing industries collapse one after another. People back then said, oh, well, we don't care about these lower grade industries. But what happened was that because we lost those companies, we then lost R&D capabilities, so on and so forth. Again, the crisis we're in. But I want to underscore that the solution is not hard. People are always scratching their heads saying, how do I fix this problem? We need better export controls that work. It's not that export controls have failed, it's export controls that are replete with loopholes fail. Export controls need to be tighter. We need to put import restrictions on the things that come from China, because we've got to prevent China from having the capital, the revenue stream, right? And so we start limiting the imports from China to make a huge dent in our economy. Then we need to look at our supply chains. How do we rectify supply chains? And I'm going to get to this defense supply chain in a moment, but we need time to rehabilitate our supply chains that have weakened over time. And I also want to really stress sanctions. China's helping Iran, China's helping Russia. It is not fearful of US sanctions power or really any US regulatory power because we haven't adequately used it. Now, in terms of looking, and we can do this, once when the US moves, we have more leverage than to coordinate with our allies. Right now, we kind of don't do it right. And so when we ask our allies to do it, they kind of look at us and say, well, you're not doing it very well anyway, so why should we follow you? We have to model exactly what success in this looks like and then convince our allies to do the same. And I want to underscore this. the more we integrate our supply chains with our allies and move away from China, the better it is for us for GDP. So do not be fooled by this argument that we actually need for economic health China. We actually need to better integrate, and there's tons of economic models that will prove this out. If you better integrate with allies, there's even better GDP growth than the status quo. But with all of our supply chain vulnerabilities, there are Chinese components in our military systems, in our personal systems, in our vehicles, in the telecommunication infrastructure, that China can switch the flip and actually disable all of our capabilities. And right now it's on for surveillance and all that stuff. Chairman Gallagher sent a letter to the FCC, for example, on some components in our Chinese components in our telecom infrastructure. It's really not that far, let's say, from a defense prime. So look at their full system, take the subsystems that maybe have tampered capabilities, tampered chips, other types of tampered components in. Look at those subsystems. It's a really simple auditing technique, and every auditor, at least a few former US government auditor, will tell you how easy it is. You take that subsystem and you just do an audit examination. You go to that first tier supplier, second tier supplier, and determine, look at their books, look at who their suppliers are. And if those suppliers then get you to another source of the subsystem, then you go to their suppliers, right? And you look at where they get their components from. You stop at the level at which the components can be tampered with. So once you find a chip, and we know that chips can be tampered with, you don't need to know, where the silicon comes from, where all the other things come from to make the chips, unless you want to look into forced labor. But it's really only 2-3 levels of audits to actually just look at books, look at who the suppliers are, and look at if those suppliers are trustworthy or not. When you look at a chip, it actually has the manufacturer, the identification information on it, right? But you don't even have to go there. You can actually look at the supplier's audit book. 2-3 levels, and you can actually get to the level of infiltration of Chinese components in our systems, and then look to replace them. I honestly don't know why the DoD doesn't require the contractors to do this, because it's really, like I said, a very simple audit exercise.
Thank you, Nazak. I appreciate that point about, export controls that work, and that means export controls that don't have loopholes. I mean, simple concept. And 2 other things you pointed out, I think make a lot of sense. Stop the revenue opportunity. If they build stuff with using equipment that's illegal for them to use, they should not be able to import it to the USA. Very simple. And then the last part, if we look at kind of the grades of restrictions, export controls are not, by far, it's a kind of middle range solution. I mean, sanctions are what's called for here. This is where you have military threats, our safety is in danger, we need sanctions. Just as business with playing in the middle ground with the export controls, it's not cutting it.
After that, you just touched on one point. The DOJ has a big role to play here. When companies have their IP stolen from China, they should not be spending money they don't have to prosecute, right? This is where the deal, and also they don't want to have retaliation from China if they try to put themselves out there to prosecute. But really, revenue is a big deal because China's putting them out of business. DOJ needs to step up and really start going to prosecuting these companies and prosecuting them expeditiously, doing interim findings to that virtually then basically block their imports, work with allies to block their imports so these companies can get back in the business. So for those of you who are kind of looking at what are one of the immediate things I can do, prosecute there's many. Wei Chang was one of the sort of the new ones who's stolen critical Chinese leading edge metrology capabilities. We've got to go after those companies and help our companies defend themselves.
That's the rule of law. Saying that here in Longworth's House building. Jeff, I want to come back to you. You made it absolutely clear. U.S. companies are making money under this regime. They're absolutely making much more money. But what's the cost to us as Americans? What's the cost to our security? I mean, how are we missing out in terms of manufacturing and jobs and prosperity? I think Nazak had a great point about, our trade and commerce in the free world has grown even bigger. Let's look at USMCA, for example. There's an upside to actually doing the right thing and the safe thing.
Yes, absolutely, Rosalind. We're making our industry dependent on key Chinese components, and nothing illustrated that better than during COVID when the auto companies had to lay off tens of thousands of workers because they couldn't get the semiconductors they needed, because a very significant portion of those semiconductors are made in China. And I would add that many people, including shareholders in these companies and the government, don't know where these semiconductors are made. For instance, Texas Instruments is a large company headquartered in Texas with a big fab in Texas, but it actually subcontracts a lot of the chips that it makes for auto companies to Asia. In some cases, it subcontracts to TSMC, and TSMC then makes those chips in China. So if you can't get a boat out of China or an airplane, you can't get those chips across the Pacific. So we're making ourselves dependent for absolutely crucial components on China, and there was a cost in terms of billions of dollars during COVID experienced by the auto companies, and of course not just autos, many mainstream appliances. You know, today your toaster and your refrigerator have multiple semiconductors in them. And to allow China to dominate these industries is literally putting billions of jobs in their hands. And that's before we even get on to military equipment. I mean, every fighter jet's got a dashboard. I haven't been in one, although I have a friend who actually owns a fighter jet and flies it around for fun. He used to work at Intel. Intel's pays pretty well. So this friend tells me that there's a dashboard in there made up of LEDs. The LEDs, about 90% of the LEDs in the world are made in China and Taiwan. And there again, China's trying to put Taiwan out of that business. And so soon every fighter jet, and I'm sure every submarine and every military vehicle's got a dashboard containing LEDs. So, you know, we are on a trend where in 5 or 10 years, almost our entire economy will be dependent on Chinese components.
So, thank you, Jeff. Steve, it's been a year now since the Biden administration put forth their export control rules, and we had the announcement today. But, you know, is this cutting it? I mean, do we see that it doesn't seem like that's making a difference. So, you know, here we are on the House side, and Chairman McCall and Gallagher have been making it clear, BIS, they're not doing the job. And they've been vocal on this, they've sent a lot of letters, they have recommendations. How do you assess that response? Will it work, and is it tough enough, and what would you say to that?
I think Jeff actually touched on what we should be doing in addition to that. We should stop providing China with the tools required to make what we're calling legacy semiconductors. Stop providing them with the semiconductor manufacturing equipment. We just have seen how SMIC has managed to break the 7 nanometer barrier. And if you haven't read Chris Miller's book on chip wars, I really recommend it. It makes that very clear why the U.S. really does have a control of these technologies. So when you consider then also that we're spending, I think it's $280 billion on the CHIPS Act. Is that?
Now it's 62, but $63 billion, Chelsea.
And some of that is going towards securing our own military supply, so that we have which what Nazak was just speaking about, a secure supply chain. It doesn't make sense, at least in my mind, why we would provide China with the same tools. We've seen this movie before where they gain our access to our technology, solar panels, 5G, Alpha-Permi, electric vehicle batteries, and then they end up subsidizing it to a degree that they drive out any international competition, and then that they pretty much dominate those critical technologies. And in fact, Chairman Xi has a tendency, similar to having military-civil fusion strategy, to announce what his intentions are. So in this case, he's announced that when he gains access to these capabilities and they can dominate the global supply chains, that they will then use that to seek political leverage to gain advantages in whichever arena that they need. So it doesn't make much sense to me, Rosalind, why we would continue to provide. The administration is continuing to permit the transfer of those capabilities. I think there's very significant national security implications. Concerning the letters that the chairman has sent out, I think the letter to the Commerce Secretary about establishing a U.S.-China working group on export controls, that they said it very well. I don't need to add to them, but basically it questions the sanity and having China involved in helping us determine what our export.
This is sort of you're referencing the visit of Secretary Raimondo to China, where she's making a working group of how to essentially manage America's export control regime. It's a kind of code word for, we're going to help you navigate our laws so you
Yes.
can continue to make business. I think that's the
Yes.
meta message. I want to go to Ms. Akir. If you would, Jeff has referenced the Huawei phone, which I think is a wake-up call. I'm curious of your thoughts. Do you think that U.S. technology was used to make this phone? And, talking about laws and needing for enforcement at DOJ, I absolutely agree. But there's a foreign direct product rule that was established precisely for this issue. For Huawei, the people who wrote that rule at BIS predicted this would happen. That's my impression. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, well, gosh, lots unfolding, but I'm going to do it very quickly. So let me just remind everybody that 20 years ago, we were not so dependent on China and integrated with China economically. And let me remind everybody that 20 years ago, you could still pretty much get things you needed, and also the United States was much stronger, both militarily and economically on the world stage. And finally, 20 years ago isn't that long ago. And now, this Huawei phone thing, absolutely no surprise. I really want to underscore, absolutely no surprise. When our rules are replete with loopholes, of course China works around them, not only by done export controls, I've done trade for a really long time. I'm an old lady, guys. China is built to circumvent. And if our rules are not ironclad, China will circumvent. With respect to our rules, I mean, actually, one more thing about Huawei. So in 2019, and this is when I was heading up BIS as the undersecretary, we put Huawei on the entity list. And in the following year, there was a foreign direct product rule, and by the time I left BIS, there was a foreign direct product rule. It sort of didn't get at the problem. So then BIS fixed the foreign direct product rule. But look what it did. It changed the licensing policy to case-by-case basis. And BIS, when you look at the statistics, they publish in annual reports, case-by-case licensing policy. If you remove the return without action, because that's just messy, but remove that from your statistical analysis, because there's a lot of issues, different things going on there. You will see that BIS has a 99% approval rate, 99+% approval rate for licenses that are granted on a case-by-case basis. So actually, once BIS put in a foreign direct product rule for sales of Huawei that actually made sense, it loosened its licensing policy, so it saw a whole bunch of licenses over to Huawei, which is what Chairman McCall had been appropriately working to fix. The other 2 points I want to quickly make is that for any of you who are really concerned about how do I fix the export control rules on dual-use items, the House Foreign Affairs Committee had a great hearing last May. Both Steve and I have written testimonies with very prescriptive things of how we need to fix the export control administration rules. So I'd encourage folks to look at that. But let me also take a moment to talk about how much China has indigenized this industry. It now makes semiconductor manufacturing equipment. SMIC, even though people say that SMIC's 7-nanometer chip breakthrough, they don't have good throughput. Guys, it has 50%, about 50% throughput. For SMIC that has unlimited federal Chinese government money, 50% throughput is just fine, and it gets better over with time. Also because of our export controls and again, remember, our multilateral collaboration has also failed because they looked to us and we're not controlling, so our allies really don't want to control. And we didn't properly lower our de minimis thresholds to properly control DUV exports to China, right, which is EUV. Well, DUVs actually can make incredibly great chips, and it's also much more complex. And China has been able to get DUV technology, the DUV equipment, and then leverage that to actually make technology and equipment that is leapfrogging what ASML is supposedly doing in EUV. That's what sort of the industry understands about China right now. So by giving it what we falsely believed is sort of lower grade technology, China has been able to leapfrog. China has indigenized the entire semiconductor supply chain. And we have now failed in actually rebuilding our own. And so now is the time where we actually need more meaningful law policies so we can move ahead.
Well, we've got about 10 minutes left, so I want to turn to the audience to see if there's some questions from the audience. Okay, well, I'll come back around. I'm going to turn to you, Jeff, again. You know, we've spent a lot of time
There's
talking.
one back here.
There was one. Oh, please, your question.
Yeah, I was just wondering, it sounds like the military civil fusion, like being done by the U.S., is that feasible? And in general, should the U.S. try to replicate some of the like initiatives by China?
Steve, do you want to take that?
Sure.
Maybe, you know, I think that it's a good question. Doesn't the U.S. have some kind of military civil fusion? And I might say one thing is the key difference between, let's say, U.S. and China. We have a civilian control of our military, unlike China. We have constitutional, you know, that would be one on a political level, but maybe more practical. I think that's his question.
I think the major difference, we do, I mean, I think any country that is concerned about defense will look for, increasingly, since, for example, semiconductors are increasingly more important for our defense capability. And so you're going to find more of that military civil fusion. That's what China calls it. DOD's been doing that for quite a long time. The major difference, though, is that there's no sense of compellence. We cannot oblige Intel to make a chip for us. We can't oblige Facebook or Meta to provide us with the data of its users. I mean, that's not the case in China. When you consider artificial intelligence, and the biggest requirement is for data, and they're sucking up everyone's data on all these various platforms, not to mention TikTok, which escapes me why we haven't done anything with that yet. That's the main difference, that it's an autocratic society where President or Chairman Xi essentially decides how they're going to run their country. And we don't do that here. None of the legal democracies have.
Jeff, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that the Department of Defense has contributed, as I think everybody knows, to technological developments in this country, you know, going back to the beginning of the internet and even before that. The problem you hear right now from technology executives is, as you know, most technology innovations start with startups. And the DoD has not adapted to the modern world of software and technology hardware. And so they still operate the way they operate with those giant defense contractors on a 3, 4, or 5 year time scale. There's a thing in the tech industry we call the Valley of Death. You develop a great product, and the customer, which might be the DoD, says, we love this, we want you to make 100 of them, but you don't have the funds to make 100. And the DoD says, well, we've got a 3-year process by which we'll approve you, and these companies are going bankrupt. So they're trying to lobby you folks and say the DoD needs to overhaul its processes and stop being so loyal to the old guys and go directly to these smaller companies. And I would urge people here who are involved in any defense committee to lean on the DoD to do this. And they're aware of it, but we need to do a lot more of that, because we're in a competition now, just like we were in a competition with the Soviet Union 30, 40 years ago, which was primarily military. This competition is equal parts military and economic, and we need to learn to move faster and to utilize the startups, which are almost, which are 90% American anyway.
Can I add something to that too? So another difference is that the Chinese government gives the PLA and its state champions tons and tons of money, and our government, relatively doesn't do that. One statistic I want to underscore is that China has the second largest GDP in the world, but one of the lowest GNI per capita gross national incomes in the world. Which tells you what, the people don't get the money, the companies don't get the money, the CCP gets the money, the Chinese government gets the money. That's how it can fund anything it wants with lots of money and then lots of human resources dedicated to it. We are not that nimble, so we need to think of better strategies And part of our strategy certainly has to be the carrot approach, but it has to be the stick approach vis-a-vis China if we're going to use creative solutions to compete against this mammoth machine.
And see if there's any more questions. Yes.
So one of the loopholes you didn't get to was cloud computing, right? That's a hot topic lately, right? That they kind of Chinese actually use American cloud computing products to do all the computing anyway and get to that. So I just would like to hear your comments on that particular level, sort of round out the loophole discussion.
And, I mean,
You're the expert on-
I could just take it sort of so not being an engineer, right? There's the White House had put out a pretty good list of emerging technologies, right? All of those things need to be controlled, and we need to control them in really a comprehensive manner. So certainly cloud computing is one of it, but our controls need to be the rules. Actually, we need to go after all these emerging technologies. We have to go after all of these foundational technologies, and our rules cannot have these loopholes anymore.
So we're going to go to our lightning round to wrap up here, and I'm going to ask each of the panelists to give our Hill audience one recommendation they can take away back to their offices. If they can do one thing, what it would be. And I'm also going to take a privilege here as a moderator to suggest one. I think it's in our paper, which you can download many materials today at China Tech Threat, but our Cash Over Country paper, we talk about something simple. The BIS should be reporting on, Department of Commerce, what percentage of chips that we consume are produced in the USA. We've given all this money to the American chip industry. There's really nothing that we ask of them, no measures. But we could at least say, are we moving the needle on chip production in the US? That's one thing. But I'm going to turn here to our panel. What is your recommendation for our Hill audience today? You can do two, but we're gonna wrap up our session before the hour.
Okay, I'm going to talk about the carrots within America and leave it to you to talk about the controls and sticks. I think, number one, the U.S. government needs people who are truly expert in the chip industry, and it doesn't have that. It needs people who can look Pat Gelsinger in the eye and say, you say you need the 25% of your revenue that comes from China. Well, we know you don't need it. We're going to cut you back by 25%, but we're going to give you a few billion to do this other kind of research and development, which is what the U.S. government and the U.S. public needs. And you need that sort of expertise to look folks in the eye and get that accomplished. And I guess if I can have a second thing, we need to think also not just about the chips. We need to realize that we're going to build a dozen fabs in this country, and 90% of those chips are going to be shipped to Asia to get packaged and put into computers and smartphones and things. So we need to think about the entire supply chain. We need to make the components here, and we need to begin moving the computers and the networking gear and the subsystems that control the braking systems in a car, for instance, and the motors in an EV need to move to this country. In other words, I think we need to think proactively about decoupling, and I think we can have a very successful economy doing that.
The first thing I would do is, in fact, it's in my written testimony to the Select Committee on Strategic Competition with China, and it deals with emerging technologies. So we've been discussing the controls that were implemented on the 7th of October last year. I find that amazing that before that, on the 6th of October, these technologies, the semiconductor manufacturing equipment and the semiconductors are largely uncontrolled because they were emerging technologies and they didn't have controls for them. So there's a whole list of emerging technology and we have no controls for most of it. I find that somewhat terrifying that this is flowing to PRC or anywhere without any controls because we can't agree as a government. We have difficulty agreeing as a government within the interagency on what should be controlled. I mean, Nazak's famous, so I'll steal her words for saying that. But that technology that wasn't controlled just a year ago had the same export control restrictions as this table. And when I've seen them licensed. We actually licensed tables and chairs to Huawei, which of course we didn't have much of a problem approving, but some of the other technologies that we did approve, that's, you know, we would see everything because they're on the entity list, but otherwise, and it was EAR 90, considered EAR 99, and so, but otherwise, we don't even see the technology. If the company's not on the entity list, we don't see it. So that, the whole process for putting laws or controls on emerging technology needs to be reformed, and I would say that's probably the most urgent requirement that we have as a government. And the way we do that needs to change because it's a BIS-dominated process right now, and it's just not working. Congress asked them 5 years ago to start implementing controls. It's been 5 years, and hardly any of it's controlled. My last real quick, since Rosalind graciously gave us 2 things that we could recommend. In May, Nazak had mentioned our testimony to the subcommittee on oversight and accountability in the HVAC. I had one item, it's the first one on my testimony, and it's like that shiny apple that's the low-hanging fruit that you can easily pick because it makes so much sense. We control items on militarily useful items are controlled. One of the reasons is for national security reasons, and within the Export Administration Regulation, the language that they use is that any technology that would make a significant contribution to the military potential, in this case of the PLA, should have a policy of denial. I mean, they have a strategy that is directed to divert technology, and then we have no means to verify if they're diverting it or not. This is low-hanging fruit. That this is something I think Congress could easily pass and have the support across.
Presumption of denial, thank you.
Not a presumption, policy.
Policy.
We've seen presumption of denial, they go back to the case-by-case basis and they end up approving it anyway. This should be just a blanket policy of denial.
Nazar, if you will make, I just got a question here, press question. Any reactions to today on the announcement, the BAS announcement today, that you would, if you could add that to your comment?
I mean, it just a quick sort of glance. I think by the time it started, we still had the press announcement. It just pretty much continues like small bites at the apple. So these are interim final rules on sort of AI chips, some technologies that they've been meeting to control. We still don't have the final rules from the October rules of last year, so we're still waiting for those. And like I said, it just pretty much looks at small bites at the apple. What I usually do when I look at these rules is I read them a few times, and don't be intimidated by reading these rules. Like, reach out to us if you have any questions. Read the rules, try to decipher as much as you can. But if you read it a few times, you start getting hang of it. But then your fourth time reading the rule, after the first 3 times, you're like, well, how does this thing? You have to take out a pad of paper and honestly map it out because it's made complicated on purpose. Then read it again and figure out where the loopholes are. And then that way you can sort of let your principals know these are the things, and these are the things that we care about, these are the things we want to fix. And I imagine the current rules will have that. I do want to just touch on sort of what we should do too. I think for everybody who's kind of sort of new at this, key terms is head-to-head competition. Look at head-to-head competition. Like any industry you're studying, look at it, there's head-to-head competition with China. Are we really competing on the same type of technology, right? And then if we are competing head-to-head, one of the things we can do is, in addition to export controls, limiting imports so our companies can actually kind of grow rather than competing against predatory economic tactics. But the CHIPS Act should really be focusing on leap-ahead technologies. But if we're going to compete head-to-head with China, we're not getting anywhere because China already has that technology. What are the leap-ahead technologies? And that's where I hope, I don't know if this is going to end up being true, but that's where I hope Commerce ends up focusing a lot of the CHIPS Act money, is those new innovators who have these revolutionary technologies that are going to leapfrog TSMC, that are going to leapfrog SMIC. That's, if we need to save ourselves, that's one of the key things we have to do.
Thank you. So, well, I want to thank our audience today, and a special thank you to Chairman Gallagher for the room that we could all meet. Again, China Tech Threat, we have more information on this topic. All of our panelists have published with us. Please follow us on Twitter, sign up for our free newsletter. We have other events, other activities. We're really pleased to have your interest. We're going to keep following these issues. Again, I want to thank the panel today. great discussion, and we will post this event online in the next week or two, so look for us there. Thank you.